Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semigog, joined today by Aureus Press, by Brandon and Hitman, two friends of the channel with channels of their own. I've been a guest with both of them, and I'm happy to have them on my channel again. The subject of the discussion, this relaxed and what I expect will be rambling discussion today, will be Michael Moorcock. In particular, his character Elric. But I believe, given the nature of what he writes and how his stories are interconnected and the idea of the eternal champion, it's really not possible or entirely desirable to talk about just the one character. So, yeah, I anticipate that we will talk about Moorcock himself, as well as some of these characters. Certainly, in my case, the experience of having grown up reading his books, quite a number of his books. If you jump over to my account on Twitter, I have a recent post where I managed to dig out my core, pulp paperback selection from, well, I guess it has Conan the Cimmerian in it, so Cimmerian. So I started reading that in fourth grade. So whatever age you are in fourth grade, and it runs up into my late teens, and it's primarily Moorcock stuff. So I'm not here today as any kind of particular expert on Moorcock or how he's been interpreted or the Elric character. Don't expect one of these high-speed slobbering razor fist rants. I think instead this will be, as I said, a relaxed discussion, and I am here just as a genuine fan of the author and his work since my childhood. And Hitman and Aureus Press are both interested in the author and the characters. They were kind enough to join us today. Before I give them an opportunity to introduce themselves and shill anything that they might wish to, I myself will shill down in the description box below. You will see links for two of my books, Cinders from the Bloomery of Youth, which is a collection of poems. And there is my science fiction sort of cyberpunkish novel set in the year 2076. It's called Vinculum. It's about a book thief who's pursuing a particular lost text and ends up himself in turn being pursued by remorseless corporate hitmen and an esoteric sect of assassins. It's set in primarily in Istanbul in the year 2076. You could see a link for that in the description box below. Thank you to all of my remaining patrons and channel supporters. They are fewer these days. I think everybody's feeling the crunch, but I thank them very, very much for their continued support. All of the credit and none of the blame. So we've got Hitman and Brandon, Aureus Press, here today. Maybe start with you, Brandon. You have a channel, you publish, have published, do publish regularly, have presence on many platforms. Let people know what's going on with you and where they can find out more about you, etc.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I publish books. All my online activities are meant to be around promoting that, but then I get lost in the in the fog of politics and distractions. I guess I always have to stop myself and think, yeah, I'm just here to grift, grift my books, get back to that. But that's what I do. Yeah, and in fact, I have it's all my own books except for the compilation science fiction series I do, Aegeon, of which there's one just coming out very quick here next month, issue number 11, which should be a good one. Incidentally, Elric was published in a similar magazine originally in installments. What was it? A British one, Science something or other it was called. No, it had science in the title, so I just knew from that it was probably science fiction, not strictly fantasy. But those things were a dime a dozen back then. I mean, I've never actually read that one, or probably there was so many of them. But that's typical of all these, the classic. I mean, so obviously was Howard and even the likes of Dune. Dune was analog. Robert E. Howard was published in Weird Tales with Lovecraft. All these things came out in serial formats, similar to the books I myself am producing. Anthologies of short stories, fantastic short stories. So, yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm also coming out with another magazine as well in probably 2 months called Guts. which is similar anthology, but it's all completely drawn comics. I'm drawing it as well as artists like Alexi Gorboot and Obsidian Bone and some others. And it's similar, except it's a little more racy, as in a big part of the premise is to push the boundaries of gore and eroticism. So it's a bit racy.
Kind of like Heavy Metal Magazine and
Yeah.
what was the other one? Epic.
Yeah, or Metal Hurlant and those. Yeah, for sure. So except every story has some extreme element of gore and sex, basically. So not you. Some might argue not very right wing of me, but of course I try to harken back to I harken back to the truer pagan roots. Maybe I guess I don't feel burdened by any moral quandary over that. So it's obviously going to be excellent.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Everybody should check it out. And you also have a YouTube channel, and you have a big account on X, do you not? That people can follow.
Yes, it's the Aureus Press on X, and it's actually the biggest I have still is on Facebook. Still somehow hanging on Facebook. Also, the Aureus Press on Facebook. Although I think it's still the official name. I can't. They won't let me change the name on Facebook. It's still Traditionalist Western Art, but I had Aureus Press as a subtitle or something. But originally, my first book was a nonfiction about art. So all my ats and that are related to that. Even though I've kind of stopped. I don't just do that exclusively anymore. But anyways, yeah, and Telegram. Telegram is the other big one I use. Also, Aureus Press on Telegram, and that's it.
Excellent. Well, everybody check out Brandon's stuff. I myself have bought one of his books. They're excellent, well put together. Hitman, thank you. Yes, sir. Hitman, thank you for joining us. You too have a presence online and on YouTube. Perhaps you can introduce yourself.
Hello. Yes, I have my own channel where Semiagog, you appeared as a guest on a stream earlier this year. We were talking about Carol Quigley's The Anglo-American Establishment, looking into the nature of the British managerial elite in the early 20th century. And I do have many other streams and discussions on my channel. As you can tell from my avatar of Sir John Bagot Club, I have an interest in the history and politics of the Middle East, particularly the modern Middle East. And at the moment, the main sort of series I'm promoting is I'm doing a series with my friend Hunger the Dye Merchant on modern Iran, going from the Safavids up into the death of Ayatollah Khomeini. So if you're interested in that, you give that a watch. The next episode should be in a week's time. Next Saturday, we'll be looking at the fall of the Safavids and Iran's 18th century end times. And I do cover other topics as well. Yes, if you're interested in that, I give my channel a follow, and I have an X account as well, which I usually use to promote my content.
Yeah, I need to plug in a maybe I can do it as a pinned comment up at the over on YouTube with your links, gents, and I'll do one after the stream ends as a reply under the Twitter stuff. So everybody definitely check out Hitman. He's got a number of great guests. I've caught at least one of his discussions with Hunger the Dye Merchant, who's a good guy. I believe you guys were talking about Christians in Lebanon or in the Levant more generally. But Hitman has had a number of guests. Didn't you have D on, Mr. D, as well?
I've had him a few times, yes, talking about art. The very first one, going back to Middle East, we were talking about Orientalism in art. Those were a good couple of streams. And then I've had him on more recently to discuss other things, including art and patronage, looking at specific artists such as Anthony van Dyck. And in terms of other guests, I've had Charlemagne on as well, who's in the chat. We talked about the Suez Crisis, and we also talked about earlier this year, we talked about the American military presence in Britain during the Second World War.
Right on. Charlemagne, good friend of the channel, who has a channel of his own as well. D, another friend of the channel, who hopefully is going to be getting serious with a YouTube channel of his own, but you can check those guys out on X, certainly. happy to see Charlemagne here. Happy to have Hitman and Brandon here. So yeah, I see. Charlemagne is saying, "Who is Elric?" Well, it's assumed that most of the people who are tuning into this are aware of Michael Moorcock's work. This character. Perhaps I should, say a few introductory words about Moorcock himself. And then we can move on to maybe we can address this question, which is, who is this character Elric? And from there, given the nature of the whole idea of the eternal champion, Moorcock's idea or literary conceit that involves having his various characters be iterations of sort of a central archetype that manifests across what Moorcock calls the multiverse. We can use Elric as a point of entry into discussing all of that. Well, Michael Moorcock himself, born in 1939, apparently in Surrey in England. He was raised as an only child by his mother in London after his father left when he was 4 years old. This is according to some sort of interview that was done fairly recently with Moorcock, perhaps in The Guardian. So that would have been about 1943. Moorcock is quite old. Yes. And his mother was apparently Jewish. Moorcock himself describes her as a chronic liar with a strong belief in freedom. There is a bit where he's not mentioned her name, but he said she was a significant influence in his life. He said, yeah, she's a chronic liar who would fabricate stories about her travels and experiences, borrowing others' stories as her own. Despite this, Moorcock viewed her positively, excuse me, noting her fierce belief in freedom and individualism, and that she staunchly defended him in things. His father, almost nothing is said about him except that he kept a very neatly ordered a motorcycle shop or something of the sort. Apparently he moved on, and his mother, Moorcock's mother, and her employer, one Dr. Ernst Jelinek, an Austrian Jewish scientist, significantly influenced his worldview. And I think something about, being someone who's Jewish who lies and tells all kinds of crazy stories about their past, that you could certainly see that in the character of who is it, Piet, in the Byzantium Endures, Laughter of Carthage series. So yeah, he left school at 15, worked as a journalist, edited Tarzan Adventures. By 17, began writing fantasy and science fiction in the 1950s. He's been married multiple times, notable partnerships including Hilary Bailey, who he had 3 children with, and then later Linda Steele, to whom he appears to be at present married. He's lived in various places, London, Paris. He's currently in Texas. Prolific writer.
Sorry, his wives aren't famous for other reasons that I'm not aware of, are they?
No.
Oh, no, okay.
Not no. If I suggested that when reading this stuff I've cobbled together, my apologies. I don't know of.
Just when you said Linda Steele, it sounded like a celebrity. That's all.
Yeah, doesn't it? Like Danielle Steele.
Yeah.
Yes.
Barbara Steele.
A prolific writer, science fiction, fantasy, and literary fiction, genre blending, focus on sword and sorcery, multiverse narratives, quite a bit of social commentary. It should be said that he considers himself a feminist, if I remember correctly. He's certainly a product of that 1960s post-war period where he really came into his own. The character Elric of Melnibone as a series, Melnibone, I'm sorry. I used to say that as a kid, Melnibone. That character appears in 1961, very much an anti-hero. We'll get into that. There's the Jerry Cornelius series, Dancers at the End of Time, Corum, Count Brass, Ericose, or however the hell you pronounce that. He loves to stick umlauts and accents on things. And he was the editor of New Worlds magazine from 1964 to 1971. He's authored over 100 novels, numerous short stories. He's also written comics, apparently screenplays I'm not familiar with, music, lyrics. There's Black Blade. He also, I believe, collaborated with them for Veteran of his Psychic Wars. He's collaborated with bands like Hawkwind. And he's been around forever. He's won some prizes. The Nebula Prize 1967 for Behold the Man. World Fantasy Award in 1979 for Gloriana. The sort of gloss of his cultural impact, anti-hero archetypes, critiques of imperialism, conformity and authority. So, one would be justified perhaps in a retrospective look at this. That's why I had on the title slate, Elric Reconsidered. In my case, it's me reconsidering it because he had such a strong influence on me as a writer. And so looking back on it is a sort of a valuable exercise to look at how reading so many of his books impressed me in a variety of ways or shaped my views and outlook. I recently watched Children of Men again, and I saw it back when it came out and I enjoyed it. And this time I watched it and I'm like, good God, I can't even take this. And that was just, back a few, not that many years back. So looking at this, which is sort of deeply ingrained in my experience as a kid growing up, is a bit of a retrospective, but I've gone on for a bit. That by way of introduction. Maybe you guys can discuss how you came across this character, what you made make of Moorcock's writing, just as a introduction kind of thing, and who this character Elric is. Let's start with you this time, Hitman, if that's all right.
Okay, well, you mentioned Razorfist earlier. Well, that's actually how I discovered Elric, is through Razorfists and videos, because I used to be quite an avid watcher of his channel. Don't really watch him anymore. Largely disagree with his political views, if I'm being honest. But that's besides the by. I got into the Elric stories because of those videos, and I even read a lot of the comic adaptions, the more recent French ones and some of the older ones in the 80s, which I've got. And I was really got quite heavily into it. And in terms of a lot of the ideas around Elric and Moorcock's work as a whole, you mentioned about Moorcock being a feminist, but it's also important that he's a self-described anarchist, and you can really see that in his work. This is sort of focus on the characters as these individuals sort of struggling against these greater forces in the world or the multiverse. So a common sort of struggle that goes on in Moorcock's work is this struggle between the forces of law and the forces of chaos, which again I think is interesting. So it's not good versus evil; it's law versus chaos, or order versus disorder, and ultimately, I think this is based on something Moorcock has said in interviews, but there's this idea that his heroes are these great men who are being subjected to these greater forces at play, and that in his view, an individual is better served by serving their own interests rather than that of any higher purpose, which is certainly a subversive interpretation. And there's also, I think, quite a strong sense of nihilism in a lot of Moorcock's work as well. Again, there's a fair bit of hedonism, though, going to that's the feminist angle. He certainly reigns in the hedonism. It's not as bad as other examples. And in terms of Moorcock's influence, it should be noted that George R.R. Martin of Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire fame, has acknowledged his the influence of Moorcock upon him. And if one has obviously seen Game of Thrones, you can clearly see the influence of Moorcock. The Targaryens and the Valyrians are clearly very similar to the Amenabenaeans, especially being these this decadent empire that's long in decline, being these dragon riders. There's so many comparisons one can draw. But not only that, you've also got Andrzej Sapkowski, the author of the Witcher series, and there's definitely some comparisons that have been drawn between those, though. Sapkowski's been certainly tight-lipped about any potential influences there.
Yeah, he definitely. I mean, he or his publishers certainly know what side of their toast has the butter on it. As far as I'm concerned, it's obvious that there was a heavy influence from Elric on that character. But I guess that works as an introduction. If you don't have anything further to add right at this moment, Hitman, Brandon, your thoughts, how you came across this guy, what you think of the character who is Elric. Introductory words.
Well, Jesus, what a story! I don't know. The details of it are so just. It's coming in and out of my life like many times, let's say. But really, my first introduction was through the music, the bands that have been inspired. There's been a lot of rock bands, metal bands that were inspired by him and made reference to. You mentioned the Black Blade song by Blue Oyster Cult. That was one, and that's actually one of their best songs too, I think. Also, the Psychic Wars that Moorcock did with them as well. But there was like, who else had Moorcock inspired tunes? It was like Hawkwind and even Deep Purple. Deep Purple has a song about Elric, I think.
Yeah, Stormbringer.
Do they?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, Stormbringer. Yeah, named after the other sword, right?
Wow. Yeah, right? Stormbringer and Mournblade. Yes.
Well, wow, which one was the one? Which one? Which one was his sword?
Stormbringer was Elric's. Yes.
Yeah.
Farewell, right. My friend. I was 1,000 times more evil than thou.
Yeah.
The moaning rune blade. Yes.
Yeah.
So you came to it through the music.
Well, my first awareness of it, let's say, and then I always had this friend, a certain friend from art school, and this guy. Holy fuck! I should even bother trying to. I should probably just to explain the character of this guy, but he was like oh my God, how do I say it? I grew up in a small town in Canada, and I was in art school in British Columbia, and this guy was from an even smaller town, and he had a really kind of a rough upbringing, but he was one of these bohemian type people you meet through your life, or maybe we met them more in the past. This is a long time ago now. And he was very extremely bohemian, and like he was always going to these kind of fetishist fucking S&M thing, like the seedy kind of dark things like this, right? But he was really into his fantasy and his things like this, and he was always telling me about this story he was reading about this guy whose sword was the sword was talking to him or influencing his mind and taking him over, and it was all about how this, he had lost control of this over this sword. And so I was like, well, that sounds great, because he was actually the first guy to also introduce me to Lovecraft, despite his dark, sexy stuff. He was an enjoyable character otherwise, let's say, but he had a severely dark side in a kind of unusual way. Let me just say, him and his wife actually were going to these like crazy bondage. I remember going to a party at his house. Like, I'm just, I wouldn't be into any of that shit. I like a little bit of sexy stuff, but none of that stupid fucking, dress up in leather and whip each other shit. Exactly. So
yes,
I'm just saying. Well, I mean, that could be okay too, I guess. But like that
wasn't an endorsement of props. I'm just beginning.
There's nothing wrong with leather. As a metal guy, I can't complain about leather or whips. I mean, shit. But I don't like getting whipped, and I don't. This is. I have to say, this is my associate. Whenever I think of Elric, I think of this guy, because he was the one who was always on about it. As sordid as the whole history of it is, and like I said, otherwise a very enjoyable character, and he actually introduced me to many things, just because he was so unhindered in his interests. Let's say, there was many things he would have shown me that people were not, that were obscure, and the kind of person you meet in art school, let's say, right?
Yes, but it seems like we can already sort of catch this the culturally subversive vibe. I mean, you've got the character of Elric himself, a Melnibonean lord,
albino,
who yes, an albino. Weak, he relies upon potions of drugs and occasionally sorcery to maintain his strength, which otherwise fails. He comes from a dying race on an island off the continent. You can see the parallels there with Count Brass and Gran Bretagne and Baron Meliadus or whatever. This idea of an echo of Britain in the multiverse. He, of course, destroys his own city, kills his cousin whom he loves, or is directly responsible for it. So there's all this sort of dark and subversive aspects, and I guess this is underscored by your encounter with your friend. So go on. Sorry.
Yeah. So even my friend reminds me of the guy himself, let's say. But So I did otherwise come across Moorcock and his other books because it seemed like back then he was everywhere on a shelf. You'd see a pulp novella, Michael Moorcock. You'd see it over and over again. As far as like one of the most published, distributed of the pulp authors at the time, I think. So I inevitably had a few, anyways, other than the Black Blade stuff. And I remember the first one I read was, to be honest, I can't remember the title, but I remember the premise, which was there's interesting things about this, and being the first one I read, because this, if you want to talk about it politically a little bit, because what was the story? It was basically about, it was sort of a man who would be king type story, except about an alternate future where the British Empire had continued, but it was almost a futuristic version of the British Empire, but they're doing all their fighting in airships. And it's all about like basically fighting in zeppelins in the sky.
That's Oswald Bastable, the Warlord of the Air.
Is that it? Okay, Warlord of the Air. That's it.
The Nomad of Time. Let me pull that up for us. Yes,
you read that one
book cover. Oh yeah, I've read almost everything he's written. Yeah.
Right. So I mean, that's interesting. I definitely got a vibe of like a pro Empire. Like it wouldn't. It's not something that. No, you didn't get that?
No.
Maybe.
No.
I mean, okay, like you have to forgive me too, because I have not read it since I was whatever age I was, not even 20, so
right.
That might
he's got quite a bit of anti-imperialist stuff, and
all right, okay.
The character Oswald Bastable falls in with a multicultural coalition that wants to actually bring down the empire. The character starts out as being very much by Jingo in the beginning of the series, but by the end he's like hanging out with an alternate universe, Nestor Machno, the anarchist, who's an airship pilot.
Right. Okay. So, I kind of remember that, but I do remember like random, even shocking snippets of racism. Like somewhere in the beginning of the book, he, for no reason, drops the N-word in like a kind of random.
Oh yeah, that's you're quite right. That's in the beginning of it. God, I'm surprised how much I remember and how much I forgot.
Because I've ever been shocked by that. I was like, whoa, why is he? That's like.
that was like underscore. Well, remember at the time he was writing it, people still said it quite casually, but it was to underscore how racist the imperial people that Oswald Bastable consorted with.
Is that what it was about? Because it wasn't an element of dialogue. It was just written as in the N words were singing in the street because it was Christmas time or something. I don't remember what. But I remember finding it harsh. But yeah, okay. So we must. I mean, I never thought much about what he must have been politically or otherwise, or what reasons he might be to be an anarchist. But you can get away, someone from his era can get away with that. I mean, his background, as you know, I wasn't aware of that either until you said at the beginning here, but generally speaking, there's many people of that time that you can forgive them more for having these. They didn't have our current insights into where these things lead ultimately. You can forgive people like him or Ridley Scott and people of that era for saying they're feminists or saying they're anarchists, because these things maybe seem more possible back then, without the
and it was very much the spirit of the age. I mean, that's kind of a theme that needs to be brought up sort of across all of this. First, I should say I'm not here to hammer on this guy. I loved his books as a kid, for better or worse, and they impressed me deeply. But at the same time, it was the spirit of the age. And if you want to think about, so-called leftists, at different times, the attitudes or the assumptions about things, if not justifiable, or certainly much more easy to explain. Imagine the leftists in around 1918 or 1920 dealing with or having dealt with the Great War and thinking, there's something wrong. We need to do something about this. And there's also the question that perhaps we can touch on in this discussion of, considering someone's artistic output independently of politics. Although in this case, his politics are so thoroughly interlarded with everything.
Interlarded. That's a good interlarded. Yeah, Jesus, I never even heard that one. You've always got a new word for me. Interlarded.
Stitched through with the fat of his politics, it becomes difficult to separate them. Hitman, do you have any thoughts on these musings, these ramblings?
Well, what I will add is that I think one thing I'll say in Moorcock's defense is, despite his politics, I actually feel he's relatively subtle compared to more modern writers. You know, I mentioned George R. R. Martin. He is far more, I think, egregiously outspoken in terms of his subversion. So that's one thing that's in Moorcock's defense. Another thing I'll say in terms of his views, this is something that he's not said himself, but something I've really spotted in his writings and also based on other criticisms he's given. He's very much an anti-romanticist. What do I mean by that? Well, you know, romanticism or idealism, you know, the idea of the ideal hero, he doesn't give that any purchase whatsoever. You know, both Elric and Coram, another of the aspects of the Eternal Champion, you know, both, you know, suffer and eventually die quite grisly deaths. So, you know, it's not a happy ending for both of them. One of the other books you had on screen earlier, Semiagog, was Gloriana. I've not read that book, but what I know of it, that book is a response to The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, which is a idealized romantic poem from the Elizabethan period. So again, there seems to be this sort of rejection of the worship of tradition or heritage or any kind of romantic view of your nation or culture. So again, it certainly is subversive, but I also see a kind of you could say gritty realism. You could almost say that Moorcock is the originator of, you know, the idea of grimdark, albeit I think he's toned back compared to what, you know, the Warhammer franchise would do with that. And going back as well, you talk about these comparisons with Britain. Well, it's very interesting going back to Elric, is that the very first Elric story is called The Dreaming City. And in that story, Elric is returning to the Melbourne, Emir, the Dreaming City, in order to overthrow his cousin Earkun, who is he left in charge while he was away, and so he wants to free his lover Cimmeril, and so they can be together. But obviously, tragically, as you mentioned, she's killed and by his own hand because Erkun throws her in the path of his sword Stormbringer, and so he comes home to Ymir to try and free Cimmeril, but ends up destroying the last remnants of the declining empire in the process. And so there's no recovery from the decline; it's just destruction, and then he just goes off and becomes a mercenary.
Yeah, and the only way the Eternal Champion can ever find any kind of rest is this quest for this city that reappears as a constant, as kind of a fixed point within the multiverse, Tanelorn or Tainlorn. I don't know how, you know, indeed, I have no idea how half of these words are supposed to be pronounced, but you know, yeah. There is this idea that there's sort of a tragic end, certainly in the grand kind of sense of tragedy, but all that the hero can hope for is to somehow position himself as a balance. In the end, you know, he serves the balance rather than law or chaos. And you see those elements sort of reoccurring across the oeuvre.
No, and one other aspect I see a lot of, especially with Elric, is this strong sense of fatalism, that you just have to accept your fate and there's not much you can do to really overturn that. And I just actually want to read a little bit from the beginning of Sailor on the Seas of Fate, because as fatalistic as this passage is, it always struck me. So, the sea that stretches before him seems weary. Great waves heave themselves together only with difficulty and collapse as if in relief, gasping as they strike sharp rocks. He would give much for a boat now, Elric thinks, for he has no food and few of the drugs which have sustained his energy. Without renewed energy, he cannot contemplate working a sorcery which might conjure him for some means of crossing the sea and escaping the dogs which at any moment must discover his scent and lead their masters to this beach. He shrugs, best to die here alone, perhaps, slaughtered by those who do not even know his name. His only regret will be that Cimmeril will wonder why he had not returned to her at the end of the year. He makes a half-hearted effort towards the sea, then pauses to let the sickly waves lap about him. Well, Stormbringer, shall we walk into the sea and end it now? At least we shall have the pleasure of thwarting those who follow us. So, hard the traditional heroism, isn't it?
Yeah, it strikes you as a series of inversions. I think I heard it described once in my youth when I was reading about him, or at some point caught that take, and it does seem to apply. When you take a look at a character like Conan, you can see, barbarian vitality. He leaps into the fray. He's, almost never tired. If you piss Conan off, he may just, brain you with a sheep bone or something that he's gnawing at the table. He laughs at the effeminacy of civilized man, whereas you have this attenuated figure with Elric, who is, a representative of a dying civilization, and he has to keep himself alive and functioning with drugs and sorcery, and he's often involved in some pretty dark shit. So there does seem to be a clear inversion there. Brendan, any thoughts?
Well, they're both a bit anti-heroish to me. Conan's not a strictly black and white good guy. He's in it for himself as well. And that is kind of the underlying theme, is as you said, chaos versus law, but it's also in the Eternal Champion, it's really sort of like the nature of individual power gain, the nature of power, which plays out a lot in these type of books, which is always very interesting because I'm still trying to figure out how it works, which Machiavelli so nicely tried to describe, which in his I think people think he was trying to be mean, but I think he was just trying to be heartfully true about what he was witnessing in the courts and the carry on of the princes, etc. Which is that it's a funny game of the eternal war of power, and you don't necessarily, it's like it supersedes morality and and so many other concerns, and that so Elric is a good example of that. He even more so, much more so than Conan, I guess you could argue. He's out for number one, right? And that's interesting.
No, certainly. One other thing I want to come in with comparing him to Conan. I mean, Moorcock deliberately wrote Elric as a foil to Conan, and
someone said that. Is that true though? Because is that really true? Because I saw someone that was a critic claim that. But did Moorcock ever say that was true? I could be wrong.
No, Moorcock did say that he was inspired to write Elric partly as a response to Robert E. Howard, but and also kind of in response to Tolkien as well. Though he did say that though he didn't quite fully like some of what they wrote, he still respected them for their efforts, and he actually met Tolkien in person and said he liked him as a as an individual. So that's in Moorcock's defense. Yeah.
Well, that's pretty cocky of him, because like Moorcock, I love his stories, but as a writer, he can't. He's not. I can't put him above Lovecraft or anywhere near to Tolkien. Or not Lovecraft. Sorry, Howard. But
and he's not even really. He doesn't manage to keep up well with Howard at his best.
Yeah, you can't say that. Like, he's got great ideas. But his actual writing is it's a bit like honestly pulpy, I guess. Whatever.
Yes, and it's very, very formulaic. I mean, you see the way that these DAW editions, one of which you see on screen here, were churned out. They're very slender books. At best, most of them you can call novellas. Gloriana and some of the others are a little bit more substantial. And later he starts to write a bit more. The Ulrich von Beck, The Warhound and the World's Pain, is one of these small little paperbacks, and then The City in the Autumn Stars, which I quite enjoyed in my youth, was a bit more substantial. But yeah, he really does come in and just repeat.
You can tell he's on a schedule of he's on a commercial schedule. Let's say.
Yes, very much so. Especially, and that's my wife was reading Elric. She's like, well, I will read these things to find out what and she's like, I liked the Elric stories, but when it got to this Vanishing Tower, I could not read it anymore. And when you've read all this Moorcock material, you dread coming across the Vanishing Tower story, because it's like he regurgitates it from 3 different points of view, or however many. I think it's a tripartite arrangement of the Eternal Champion, these 3 parties all being present at one time. The first time you read it, you're like, okay, that's kind of cool. Second time you read it, you're like, man, maybe I'll just skip ahead here. So in terms of his...
So just to come in quickly, because I actually had that because I told you I recently read Corum for the first time, and I was like, oh, wait, he's telling the Vanishing Tower from Corum's perspective. I was like, okay, that's interesting, but a bit lazy. Yeah, I agree with you, more or less.
Yeah, so lazy, it sounds like the three of us don't imagine that he stands as a great of fantasy and science fiction based on his pure skill as a writer. Now he has done, I mean, apparently there's some sort of London trilogy that I had never looked at. I was getting too old for it by the time I was, I mean, how old are you in fourth grade? I can't remember, like 9 or something. That's when I started reading Conan, and then by late fifth grade, I was reading Moorcock because I had gotten into D&D. You know, my story was that I got the old deities and demigods book, and it had the Melniboné and the mythos, as they put it. And so I was looking at, Elric, a black blade that sucks souls. I mean, honestly, it was just a sword being black that was the first thing that drew me to it. And it was only years later that I discovered among the Turkic tribes and the Persians, there was a particularly high quality of steel called woots, which is a crucible steel. And they etched the blades of so that it would show the grains, so to speak, of the crucible steel that had been hammered out. And it looks sort of like an oily black, tiny sort of almost reticulated pattern. And so there were black blades, and they were the finest quality steel once upon a time.
Cool. That is cool. You know, I want to say before I forget to, there was actually also a German power metal band, a new one called Eternal Champion. I forgot about them because I actually saw them 2 years ago. They're actually pretty good. So just to show that he's still inspiring. These stories still are inspiring art and music, and the absolutely prolific amount of visual art, paintings, and illustrations based on these stories. Like not just done for the books, but like just that it inspired. Like there's so much. I don't know if you know. I keep coming across it all the time. Doesn't maybe compare to the amount of Tolkien stuff you can find, but still like a lot. Usually, and if it's ever a Moorcock thing, it's usually the Eternal Champion stuff, or the Black Blade stuff.
Yeah, and lots of it. I remember, what was it, White Wolf Publishing or whatever appeared. In my day, it was all these little doll books, and even older ones, some of which I was able to get my hands on. But the distribution, the main. Yeah, they were around for a while, and maybe they're still around. They would basically produce these, sort of fancy hardback editions that collected all the tales of a particular character.
Right.
Or maybe it was White Wolf. Maybe there were role-playing games too. I remember there was also a big box board game called Stormbringer that had, the original version had great cover art. But so they were coming out with these paperbacks back in the day when I was a lad. But as I think you're saying, he's just inspired republication and a huge fan base.
Yeah, and there was attempts, I think 2 attempts to make it into a film. One fell apart with a major studio for whatever reason. These things fall apart. It was close though, apparently. And they're still thinking about making some probably no doubt shitty was it a cartoon or like a series for something? Probably, I don't. Probably some low budget film.
Well, a few years ago, there was talk about making a potential Elric TV show, and it got shot down because, well, why would we? There's already a Witcher show.
Yeah, that's pretty dark, man. That they just.
I never saw The Witcher. What is The Witcher? Just a ripoff? I don't know actually what The Witcher's about.
Well, I played a little bit of the first Witcher game, and I've seen enough of it to know that it's very similar to Elric, and there were certain claims about certain uncharitable influence there, but
apparently that maybe there was a lawsuit. I can't remember. So the original character that had pink eyes in The Witcher now, which is straight up albino ripoff, ends up having yellow ones or something. So
Right, yeah, because I remember seeing these big. Yeah, he's almost an albino looking guy. I know. I've seen the imagery of the Witcher series, and he's like a blondie guy. Yeah, looks like a Legolas on steroids or something.
yeah, much too muscular. And generally, the Elric characters are depicted as too muscular. That's why I like these Michael Whelan covers, like the one that you can see here. I believe that's a Whelan as well. He didn't overdo it with the giant muscles.
No, he's meant to be thin blood and sickly. And
yes, that's why he needs the Morn blade in order to
get power. Yeah. One thing I wanted to say too, like he was referencing, so he was ripped off by The Witcher, and George R. Martin borrowed heavily from him. I never read Martin's books. I've obviously seen the TV show, but I mean, in both cases, in a lot of these cases, they're kind of reimagining a Dark Ages. Martin, more specifically, is obviously just like reimagined Britain, ancient Britain, and with the North, the Hadrian's Wall or whatever, right? But you can really see that in Elric as well. It's just kind of like even the names and stuff are kind of like just vaguely similar to Dark Agey, feudal or whatever kind of War of Kingdom stuff. And it's sort of like almost all fantasy is like that to one degree or another, but there's something quintessentially kind of English about it, I find, or English history about it, about the Elric stuff as well.
It's interesting you say that because
go on.
Sorry. No, go on.
Sorry, because it's interesting you say that, because I talked about Moorcock, liking Tolkien personally, but not really liking some of his writing. Well, he actually wrote an essay called Epic Pooh, where he lambasts Tolkien's idea of the Shire and the idea of merry England. It's all very cheerful and happy and green. He completely hates that pretty much, which you can clearly see from reading Moorcock's work. It's all very gritty and realistic, and horrible things happen. They've got rape, genocide, war, murder, death.
Yeah, great stuff for like what I remember in one particular story. I can't remember which character it was. Maybe it was Coram, dealing with the Mabden. But there's this one, or maybe it's Elric, but he's in some facet of the multiverse, and these group of dirty, men come up to him, and he remarks that he can see the lice crawling in their beard. For a kid, was it Coram? So as a kid growing up, I have to confess, I read the Fellowship of the Ring twice. I could not stand any of the Tom Bombadil shit. I know that this is entirely heretical. But I understood it. I loved looking at the alphabets that had been produced that you could see in the appendix, or appendices, and I understood him as a great writer, and indeed he is, and certainly one who will, I think, stand the test of time much better than Moorcock himself. But as a kid, I just didn't give a shit. I wanted to read Conan. I wanted to read, Michael Moorcock stuff. I want, the idea that you would be on a flying carpet or with some weird flying contraption. I remember there's some Coram thing where he escapes in some sort of strange flying thing. The idea of the Eye of Rin in the hand of Quill or whatever. The, Prince Gaynor the Damned, Blood and Souls for my Lord Ariok. All of that was, it was strong. I wanted to read it, So in terms of entertainment, I still tell my wife when we're going to watch a movie, and we're well paired, because I'm like, I don't want to watch a fucking, an intellectual film. If it doesn't have a fucking sword fight, I don't want to see it. And she's like, yes.
I don't want to watch a fucking intellectual film. That's funny. That's funny.
Yeah. So
you want to see you want to see Sword and the Sorcerer or something like. There's still many a 70s or 80s schlock barbarian movie I haven't seen. I must try to track them all down and see every last one. It's true. Yeah.
But they're all so bad. They're all
so bad. Like, so bad they're good. Yes, so bad you have to live it, like fucking Deathstalker and all that. Come on, you gotta love it.
Beastmaster. That was oh man, Rip Torn with that fake nose.
Classic, totally classic.
So, but to come back to them, I think there is definitely a program of a subversion that seems to have been consciously undertaken. Now, I think it was a literary exercise in his case, literary in quotes, but let us say it was a writing exercise, and it was a way of approaching the subject. And to me, it was interesting. I'm not sure that I would. I don't know. I haven't gone back and read any of it probably in 15 years. It might have been 20 years since I read any of it.
Oh yeah, me too. Easily, yeah.
Stuff again. Yeah. But I loved it as a kid. But the thing, Brandon, you were on the Conan stream, I believe. Even that strikes me as, certainly sort of leftist in some sense, or libertarian, or classically liberal, so to speak. You've got Belit, on the Black Coast, or who's that? There's another woman that he runs into in Black Nails, who's another warrioress. Howard seems
Red Nails,
like,
these,
Red Nails? Yeah, Red Nails, but I can't remember who the character was. It wasn't Belit, but it was another like female pirate, and
right.
So he's got sort of this. Sort of
like strong female characters. I mean, like a Red Sonja.
Yeah, but a nascent kind of girl boss idea. No, it wasn't Red Sonja. It was another woman who
I know, but just that archetype of the barbarian fighter woman or whatever.
Yeah, Valeria, something like that. Yes. So I'm sorry, someone in the chat was sharing. Thank you, Chad Thundercock.
Yes.
Yeah, but so it, even looking at the Conan stuff, you could see, the strong frontier person who, has cut his teeth in the real world, and female characters, you can swing a sword as well as a man. There's sort of an early American, let's call it small L, libertarian attitude that is conveyed even in Howard's works. I suppose you don't get that as much with good God, I'm old. What's his name? The Yog Sothoth. Lovecraft.
Lovecraft. Lovecraft. Yeah.
You don't quite get that with Lovecraft, but yeah, I kind of want to come back around to this idea of how are we to assess his writing, Hitman?
Well, ultimately, as I said, I've read Corum more recently, and I've reread some of the Elric comics. I still think he is a good writer, and he can spin a good yarn, as it were. I definitely think that even though I say he's this originator of this, modern sort of gritty, realistic fantasy, I think he's much better than, later on other people, like Neil Gaiman or George R.R. Martin, for example.
And by the way, my hatred, I'm sorry, just
Neil Gaiman is shit.
I fucking loathe that piece of shit. Anyway, sorry, Hitman.
No, that's all right. And but no, but what's also interesting is you spoke about this idea in Howard of the kind of having this American sort of frontier spirit. But what's also interesting is I kind of feel that Moorcock, interestingly enough, I feel like in his stories, he's almost embracing that American pulp element in his work, as opposed to the traditional British fantasy like Tolkien. I mean, for example, one thing I noticed is that, just talking about Elric and Corum, well, both Elric and Corum are both aristocrats or royalty. Elric starts out as an emperor and Corum is a prince. He's the prince in the scarlet robe. Both of them lose their kingdoms, and they're both forced to become like these warrior champions. So it's almost like they become self-made men, which seems very, very American to me. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, it is true. I don't know if you're asking me or not. I'll jump in anyway. Sorry. that is all true. And certainly being the famously Texan individual he was, I guess Howard might have those inclinations. But I think like Howard more perfectly, say Tolkien. So you could say Moorcock's criticism of Tolkien, like The Shire and the Tom Bombadil kind of perfect archetypal goodness and perfect innocence. I mean, that probably comes down to Tolkien's ardent Catholicism and his totally binary Christian concepts of good and evil kind of thing. Mordor is evil, the Shire is goodness, and it's a bit too possibly in some ways twee and innocent. And then you have Moorcock, who's takes all that and sees it nihilistically, and like, no, it's all about power and selfishness, and he's countering that. But Howard has the perfect symbiosis, I think, which is the true archaic values, which is that yes, the natural values are brutal, and there's a lot of harsh, brutal things are going to happen, etc. But you kind of take the good with the bad, and you revel in it all, and you get what you can, like in a Conan-esque kind of way. He has a certain law of good and evil about him. We shouldn't make this about Conan. I'm talking too much about Conan. But I just want to say, like, if you even mildly annoy him, he might kill you, I guess. But it's all done in a kind of there's a joyous value system to it that I would personally agree with and relate to more in Howard than. And you might look at Tolkien and Moorcock as polar opposites. What do you think of that? I don't know.
Yeah, well, there's certainly I mean, as we talked about, there seems to be this attitude of intentional program of inverting the elements in order to explore taking it from a different direction, and he has certainly been successful in it. I did want to point out, though, since the idea was brought up that there's sort of this American aspect of it. And Moorcock wrote under the pen name Edward P. Bradbury. You can see what he was trying to create there. And basically, he just sort of picked up on the old Marsh stories of Burroughs. So you could sort of see that he paid his dues trying to do things in terms of what was popular with American pulp of the classic period. And also, if I remember correctly, maybe Hitman, I think Elric, Michael Moorcock has explicitly stated that he was influenced also by Mervyn Peake, the Gormenghast
yes,
series.
He did say that, yeah.
And have either of you read any of that? I have.
I haven't.
No, is it good? What's that about?
It's very, very mad. I once had a girlfriend who was named after a character in that book, and so I went and read, I think, the first one. I think it's the Gormenghast trilogy, and Peake eventually went mad. He was an artist and a writer, and he did apparently go fully mad. And the Gormenghast is just this. It's this strange story of a mad, almost senile family in the sprawling network of palaces that are all sort of interconnected as one giant palace. It's very difficult to read for me because it didn't really have any sword fights. As I've said before, I mean, I just don't really care. Why do all stories not have swords and sword fights? I mean, it's like, why would I even read it, or why? I mean, I guess there could be gunfights, but otherwise, like, yeah. So I think there's some of that by way of mention of influences. I realize I'm all over the place. I open the floor to you gents to bring up or cover things that I'm missing or that you think should be mentioned. Take the reins.
Well, another thought that's come to my mind in terms of Moorcock's version of the traditional hero, but another thing you can spot, we've touched on it a little bit already, is that his heroes, obviously, we're talking about A View from the Right, where we love to talk about physiognomy never lies. Well, it's not quite physiognomy, but something similar is how Moorcock's heroes are physically imperfect. We talked about how Elric is sickly, he has to take drugs to survive, and also he's an albino. Well, also with Corum. Now, Corum is born and described as being quite handsome, but early in the first story, he's badly maimed. He has his hand cut off and his eye gouged out, and it's described quite explicitly that when reflecting upon his wounds, he said, I was handsome once. His handsome prince has now been forever scarred. So it's almost like this idea of innocence lost, so to speak. And despite Corum's attempt to try, because he, as an interesting comparison to Elric, Corum actually seems to try and not be so hedonistic and actually try to live by virtues such as justice and order, but he's ended up forcing to come to using, I think, more underhanded or brutal means in order to achieve his objective. So it is almost like the corruption of the champion, so to speak.
But even justice and order itself. Oh, sorry. Go on. Yeah.
No, go ahead, sir.
Oh, I just wanted to make a glib comment. Justice and order itself is only the product of the last guy who got enough power to set the rules of it, right? In a way.
Yeah,
so like he's right about it. I don't see it myself nihilistically, so I just see it as, oh, how can I put it? I don't get all like, I'm just not a nihilistic person, maybe. I don't know. There's joy in the contest of power and how things work. It's just very difficult to hold on to anything definitely. And so Moorcock certainly understands that, and that it does come down to that. And, also legacy, which is a very Homerian, the concept of the legacy, like even say Elric, and for all his efforts and his wrangle with the sword just to kill his cousin and everything he has to do. It's all to what's it for ultimately? It's for, if we're talking about a fictional character, but if you compare it to real history or real myth, there's not much to the power thing apart from the legacy you leave behind and the influence you had, which is setting your own values and laws and things. And
yeah,
I'm not even sure
this idea of trying to find a peaceful place to get away from this eternal struggle between law and chaos. The idea of attempting to bring it into balance in some sense. You have like in Count Brass himself is in some analog in another facet of the multiverse that's like the Camargue and the forces of Gran Breton with their different mask clans are trying to overrun this beautiful place. There's another one where maybe it's in Corum where there's some analog of Mont Saint-Michel with a causeway that's covered by the sea at times. And so there are always these idyllic places that Moorcock appears to have enjoyed in his life visiting, and they're overrun by these forces of chaos. And so all that can be done, this champion is drawn into it again and again and again. But, this person, as I mentioned earlier, wants to find Tainlorn, this place of peace, just to relax. And it never really happens for them. They're always drawn.
It never manifests.
So there is kind of a Ragnarok vibe, the idea that you're going to fight and it doesn't matter if you win or lose, you'll have to do it.
Yeah, well, that's life, really, isn't it? I mean, that's not unreal in a way. Like even Tolkien understood that. The men had to get up and fight. But you just reminded me, there's another band, another classic band. What are they called? The Tigers of. There's an island mentioned in
the Tigers Pantang.
Yeah, right. Named after Moorcock again. And also, I read once, and no one seems to have heard of this one, but I read it in an interview for sure. It's in my memory from 10, 15 years ago, that he was good pals with who's that 70s rocker? Oh God, what's this? T-Rex. And that T-Rex and Moorcock.
Mark Bolan.
Yeah. So you heard this, did you?
No, but you.
Okay. Yeah, that guy. Yeah. So they lived in the same. I don't know if it was a council estate or something, like some sort of whatever. I don't think it was. They're not. They grew up humble enough wherever it was, but they were neighbors and knew each other well. And so T-Rex would go and talk to this guy, and it was Moorcock. I mean, I read this in. I'd have to verify it again now because it's been a long time, but I do recall reading that for sure. Which is funny, all the connections he had.
Yeah, he was tied in with these bands. He was certainly tied in with 60s and 70s developments. I think it occurs to me that that's perhaps one way to look at him. In terms of coming out or at least becoming popular. You've got references to Tolkien and Led Zeppelin, of course, and other bands. So he became popular during that time period. I'm no expert on Tolkien, so all of you Tolkien autists, be gentle with me. My sense is that Tolkien was in some sense picked up by the people in the 60s But he himself was certainly a reactionary, not a reactionary, but he was more traditional, certainly in relying upon his studies of languages and history, whereas Moorcock seems to come in and be, sort of quote unquote countercultural 60s. He seems to embody that spirit of his age, and he carried it forward, and that includes many references to drugs in his works. I remember the first time I ever did cocaine in high school, and I was like, well, I guess I'll try it because Piat in Byzantium Endures did, so you've got the drugs
of all the reasons.
Of all the reasons. I mean,
that's funny.
Who knows, man? But it very much so. There's this constant sort of this idea of a multiverse, which is sort of postmodern rather than the modern idea that there is an arc to history and that we have arrived at sort of a climax of a historical process. Instead, that's been broken down and it's been fragmented, and you have a multiverse posed as a counter to a universe. You have sort of the idea of stability versus entropy, and how these are two poles, and you've got to strike a balance between them rather than any sort of absolute moral stance. And so, you have these characters who start out, certainly in Elric's case, being devotees of chaos, and then ultimately they come to attempt to deal with the balance. So Moorcock's in there with his drugs and his, half psychedelic bands. I mean, I think you could. Hawkwind's hard to pin to a genre. Only those guys who work in record stores and have gigantic, forking musical influence trees probably would want to take a guess at how to describe it. But yeah, so what do you guys make of? What would you guys make of this idea that he sort of carried this countercultural thing of the 60s forward, but made it accessible in pulp?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. No, certainly.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go on.
I was going to say, because the ability to come up with all these different characters and ideas, but still explore the similar motives is good. And another thing that I think Moorcock does better than most of his modern incarnations is that, as Senegal mentioned earlier, that most of his stories are quite short. So like 100, 150 pages. They're not like Game of Thrones, which just goes on, like each book is like 800 pages long or something.
So have you guys both read Game of Thrones? What's your opinion of his writing? I don't know.
I've read all of them, and at the time I thought they were great, but after reading Moorcock, I just think if anybody was asking me for recommendations of who to read, I'd say Moorcock every single time. You're just getting the same stuff, but like you'll get it through for it a lot quicker.
Yeah, right.
With George R.R. Martin, you've got when I first read it, it was long before any mention had been made of a television series or anything like that, and I was like, this is a guy who very clearly has some sort of, I don't know this to be true because I never looked into Martin. I find him vaguely repulsive, but when I read it at the time, I was like, this must be a guy with screenwriting experience who has written this whole package with the idea of its adaptation in mind. Like Moorcock, who will take bits and pieces of history. You've got the idea of the king who sleeps under the mountain. I believe that's a central idea with Corum, if I'm remembering right. You have elements that are carried forward, the silver hand or whatever, or the metallic magical hand on Corum, make you think about Tiwaz or something, whoever it was who had his hand snipped off, bitten off by the Fenris wolf. You have the idea in Martin of carrying, he's stealing shit everywhere. They're Westmen, so he calls it Westeros to have the idea of the West. The Iron Bank.
So it's such an easy, sort of it's an easy lift he took. Yeah, just a bit lazy.
But well, I mean, no, it was a lot of hard work to assemble it. But what he does is he makes sure that there are analogs of things that we know of from our world and history that have been reflected in fiction, and he just makes sure to tap each one of them. Like the sand snakes women or whatever come from come from something that's like Spain, and so they're proud and they want to
Right.
duel. And the Northmen are like people from Scotland or something, or from I don't know, up north of the wall,
Right.
and these kinds of
I
things.
just
So
know.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. Finish. I don't want to cut you off. Sorry.
Oh, the last thought was just that I don't like Martin, but in terms of someone who had a business proposition and an idea, he clearly did much more work, with outlining and character planning and naming conventions and world building. Each great house having a motto and an insignia. He just did a lot more work to plan what he was going to write for that series than Moorcock stuff, which to me comes across as sort of occasional pieces. He's basically just shitting out these, like Hitman said, 110 page little novellas to meet a commercial schedule, as you were saying, Brandon.
But his ideas are better and somehow more original, at least.
And Moorcock can at least finish a character story through to completion, unlike George R.R. Martin.
Yeah. And George R.R. Martin, I want to talk about physiognomy. George R.R. Martin, Jesus Christ. I mean, that is like mystery meat that crawled out of a ditch, crawled out of the ocean. I mean, I don't know what he's supposed to be, but holy shit. Let's see that guy. Like, where indefinable.
Yeah, there's something going on with gills under that beard. Yeah.
He's strange, man. And like, actually, when it was recommended to me years before, the only time I heard it before the series is I had a friend recommended to me, and it immediately made me feel nostalgia for the crazy art school Mr. Sexy Balls guy, because everything that guy recommended was pure gold in terms of books and movies. And he's the first person to show me like the Misfits and all these bands. But this more normal guy, he had bad taste because he wasn't like a normal person, and he loved the George R.R. Martin. I remember that.
Yeah, I'm like fucking dwarfs and incest in the first book. Like, I mean, come on. Yeah, there's a certain lurid aspect, a willfully lurid aspect in the George R.R. Martin stuff that's, designed to have something, the blouse ripper aspect to it, and the sort of cheap pulp half sex novels that you would buy in a yellow bookstore, as well as all the swords and sorcery. So as a product, it's very carefully constructed, but I don't find it pleasant. Moorcock at least seemed to want to bring a degree of philosophical sophistication to his work. I mean, I came across it as a lad, as I said, and I remember coming across this character of Nestor Machno in the Oswald Bastable, the Warlord of the Air series.
Yeah.
And I went looking for information on Nestor Machno in high school, and I did a freshman, paper on Nestor Machno, and this girl I wanted to date at the time went home and happened to mention that she'd seen me talk about this Ukrainian anarchist from the First World War and the Russian Civil War, and her mother's boyfriend was some sort of burned out anarchist with a pseudonym, I feel, because he never told anyone his name was anything other than Jim Black. And he committed suicide a short time thereafter. And this girl,
the fate of all anarchists is ultimately suicide. Sorry,
the girl from my school came back and said, Jim was so impressed with you that, and I think I met him or I talked to him on the phone or something. He's like, there's some high school kid studying Nestor Machno. And so I talked to him. Then later he killed himself, and her family came and said he would probably want you to have his book. So I remember they opened up this storage space, and I carried home all these. I've still got a lot of them, Timothy Leary's like Prison Diaries and
how are those? I never read those
books, and I didn't read that, but I've still got the Psychedelic Experience by Metzner and Leary and some others. I got all kinds of huge amounts of those Osprey Men-at-Arms books and good historical books. Everybody dies and gives me their books.
But that was the thing with Moorcock too, is like it was just on the shelves. Like I said that already, but everywhere. But back then, this is the 80s and 90s. You just went to you would see book racks anywhere, and it would be like Moorcock, and like some of them would actually be pretty bad. I remember seeing. There was one I had. There was a few that you just buy it because you like the cover, right? You wouldn't know, like, hey, look, there's an airship, there's a monster, or whatever, and it'd be like expertly, obviously, excellent pulp paintings covers. And there was a few you'd buy that were really just stinkers, like really very poorly written. Everything about them sucked, more or less. But like, still, I remember there's one I bought that had a Frazetta cover of like a centaur or something like that, and like the story was just pure nonsense. It was hopeless. So it was a bit of a grab bag. You weren't guaranteed goodness, but you would just see these racks and they'd entice you with the covers, and you would buy it. I remember buying a lot of albums that the same. Yeah, it was all about the cover, and same for albums back then. You went in and you just thought, oh, I like that, picture of that, dragon and that woman on the or the barbarian and whatever, and you just buy the album. You wouldn't know what the hell it was. Moorcock was there. He was part of that. That's part of his whole thing. So he saturated those shelves with stories, and he was pretty good. He was good.
Yeah, there are just enormous amounts of his books. Actually, let me see if I can show this, just because it's. Let me see if I can pull this up. Can I pull up an image file this way? It should be a JPEG. Good gracious! Let me find this folder. Yeah, maybe I can pull this up. Will it come? There? Yes. Does it appear? Yes. Here we go. I pulled out my old box of these. These were the books. You can see on the far left there. After Conan of Cimmeria, there's Conan the Usurper there. You can't read the cover anymore because one of my mother's cats got after it. But yeah, I started reading that in 4th grade, and you can kind of see how I moved from Conan into Zelazny and Moorcock. So starting, the last quarter of the top row is all Moorcock, and you can see below it's just all Moorcock. And this is leaving out the hardbacked ones that I had in another box, and you could see all those yellow daws. Once upon a time, whenever I went into a used bookstore, I'd look for those yellow daws because I knew I could spot Moorcock books more quickly. But there are a lot of older ones in here that does this allow me to? No.
And would you say that Elric was his best work? Because I actually haven't, apart from that stuff and the airship and a handful of others, I wouldn't have read as much of it as you. What would you say is his best stuff? Is it the Elric stuff?
No, I'll be interested to hear what Hitman thinks. But the Elric stories really, to me, were the least interesting of all of them. They're the ones that I started with. But yeah, the Elric stuff was not. I don't know. I liked the Quorum books much better than the Elric ones.
I haven't read those. What are they about?
They're just another version. Instead of saying it's a Melnibonean albino, it's a Vadhag, or however you say it, some sort of high elf analog of in Moorcock's world with sort of an overlay of some old Celtic and maybe even some Germanic myths. Hitman has read it more recently. But before I turn it over to Hitman, I liked the Ulrich von Beck, the Warhound in the World's Pain, and the City in the Autumn Stars much more. And yeah, that was probably my favorite of his stuff. The Elric, it just meh, and then Quorum was probably my second favorite.
Really? Okay, shit, I'm missing out.
Yeah, Hitman. How would you characterize the Quorum stories?
Well, I'm gonna say, obviously, as I've only really read the Elric stories and Quorum stories. Obviously, I started with Elric years ago and only revisited it more recently. I really liked Elric at the time, but after reading Quorum, I do think Quorum is better as a whole. Though I will say, because with the Quorum stories there are 6. You've got the Swords trilogy, and then you've got the second trilogy, whose name I forget the name of. I really love the Swords trilogy. I actually think it's the best Moorcock work I've read of all the stuff I've read of his. Whereas the second Quorum trilogy I didn't think was quite as good as the first one. They're still quite good as a whole. And again with Coram, because he serves law and is actually trying to, not be like a complete hedonistic arsehole. I feel like he's more likable as a character, whereas Elric just seems too, I don't know, just far too hedonistic and self-interested.
He's not likable. Yeah, he's not likable. That's true. That's true.
Well, there's the tragedy of him, that he just can't get anything right, and then he gets killed by his own sword. I wonder.
Yeah.
I wonder.
Well, that's cool. That's that kind of cool, and that's kind of the kind of unexpected thing you want. You don't want to, because so much pulp of that time would be just like the pat, the 3-part story arc, thing you're expecting, right? Like it was good,
right?
In that sense, the darkness of it is really what made it.
Well, it's been demanded of us. Well, not demanded. Charlemagne's just fucking around, but he has raised a fair point, which is, you haven't really talked about Elric much. What do you gents? I mean, Elric is his best known character, I think. People who know of him more superficially are, Elric, and there's the attraction for me, as I said, of this black. I mean, really, it was all about Stormbringer and sorcery. I love how he summons Mirklar, Lord of Cats, or he says blood and souls for my Lord Ariak, or, I guess, did Elric also have Elric had the sidekick Moonglum. Who was the Coram had? Was it Yaria Connell? Who had the cat on his shoulder?
Yes, it was Jerry Connell. Yeah, the guy that transfers between the planes of the cat. Yeah.
Yes. So Elric, I mean, what are your takes? Let's start with you, Hitman. Let's talk about Elric. Who is this guy? What is this character? And can we can we sort of distill anything? Can we look at can we attempt an interpretation of the Elric tale and what it signifies, what its subtexts might be?
Well, it's ultimately a tragedy in the grand stretch of things. Elric, again, he's the 428th Emperor of Melna Bene, this island nation that once ruled this world-spanning empire, dominating the Young Kingdoms, but it's recently in decline and just been retreating back to just this island, where it fends off attacks from these barbarian raiders, which we actually see Elric defends his realm against it in the first story. And as we mentioned earlier, he's now bino, he's sickly, he has to consume drugs to survive. What's also interesting in terms of his tragic character, when he was born, his mother actually dies in childbirth. So again, that's another element as well. So he's seen as a cursed character. He's now bino. His mother dies in childbirth. He's sickly, and throughout his early years, he's constantly challenged by his cousin Earcoon, who is seen as by many of the Melniboneans as a better claimant to the throne because he's not an albino and not sickly. And also, it's important to remember that something that's very interesting with Elric is that you see the side of him more in the very first story. Is that when he was a prince, he was very philosophical. So he's very much likes to read books. He's very introverted, whereas Melniboné was this grand conquering empire. Earcoon, if he had his way, he was the ruler of Melniboné, they would go off conquering and raiding. But all Elric wants to do is he wants to read books and learn from the Young Kingdoms on how to reform Melniboné. So he's kind of a like a philosopher king, in a way. And and the pull of the first story is that Earcoon, during this raid on Melniboné, knocks Elric into the ocean to try and kill him and then usurp the kingdom. But he's foiled when Elric comes back and is saved by it's like this. He summons like this god of the ocean or whatever to aid him, and so he comes back. He locks up Earcoon, planning to punish him, but then Earcoon flees with Cimmeril, and he has to go on this like wild goose chase around the world to essentially try and bring Cimmeril back. And this ultimately ends up leading him going into like some other plane after Earcoon, and it's actually in this place that Elric finds one of his other companions, Rakir the Red Archer, who is
Rakir the Red Archer, and he has to go find the swords in the womb place or whatever, if I remember right.
He finds the swords, and then there's like an epic duel between Elric and Earcoon with the swords, and one aspect of that Joel always thought was cool is it's interesting. Elric is like hesitant because both Stormbringer and Moonblade are both soul-stealing swords. They both are like sentient. So the sword whispers to Elric, I want souls.
Mournblade.
Yes, and so the sword wants to kill Kuhn, but Elric is like, no, I'm the master. I willed you. We will only disarm you, Kuhn. We won't kill him. And it's just interesting seeing this discipline displayed by Elric early, as these are lost in later books when he just fully gives in to the desire to kill and just lets Stormbringer have its way. It's almost like Stormbringer wields Elric and not the other way around.
Yeah, that is the cool thing about the story, I think. And that's how it was described to me by my kooky friend. It was that, like, you think it's about this, fantasy story, but it turns out to all be about the sword he gets and how the sword takes control. Because the sword, every time he kills somebody, the sword gains that person's soul power or whatever, right? And isn't there a point even when he kills the woman, or she throws herself on the sword to intentionally give it the final power he needs or something like that?
Oh, no, Irkun throws Cimmerul towards Elric, and then Elric was just striking forward to hit Irkun, so he ends up hitting Cimmerul and killing her. And it's,
okay. I remember that wrong.
Yeah. Well, one benefit of Stormbringer for Elric is that because he's sickly, by absorbing souls from killing people, it rejuvenates him, meaning he doesn't have to use drugs. So that is one major benefit of him using it. Though one downside is that Stormbringer, like a human, can only sustain so much, and if you kill too much, the sword stops working. As I think it
becomes
in the Vanishing in the Vanishing Tower, like he's just fighting his way through like a horde of like barbarians, and then suddenly like Stormbringer's like, I've had enough, and then he gets like captured.
Yeah. Yes. So it's that kooky other angle where the sword is actually the ultimate kind of protagonist of the story. Is the weird thing that is like very unique, I think. No.
Yeah, well, I mean, that goes back to the old ideas that there was a spirit in the blade, and the idea of the blade being carved with runes. This is one of those cases where he dug into older traditions and carried them forward in a clever way. And the more you talk about this, both of you mentioning this, I think, it's a clear, there is some aspect of an anti-war metaphor, but it's more sophisticated than just being like, let a djinn bone my ass as an Arab taxi driver and Neil Gaiman. It's not, just a sort of straight social, it's not just a straight sort of trite, progressive social observation, because the idea is that though there's this sort of anti-war dimension in the idea that, well, I mean, basically he's saying he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, and literally that's what happens. So it seems to inform this idea that you take up this weapon, that it's hungry for blood. It's easier to start it than to stop it. But even then, when you think that it's going to give you an advantage, there's sort of a fickleness to circumstance and violence. So you can find that this great power abandons you, sort of as though Stormbringer, fails to become erect at the, for the money shot there when he's fighting all these, this barbarian horde. So yeah, there's definitely this idea of the sword being a central character. And now that you mention it, that really was something that was very, very interesting to me about it as a kid, because of course Stormbringer survives, spoiler alert. So there is that aspect.
And one
that's
thing.
No, you got it.
Okay, yeah, that's also interesting because someone's spoken about the idea of Stormbringer being a demon, but we must remember that something I neglected to mention in the first story is, well, how does Elric go on this quest? Well, he asks for aid from the Chaos Lord Ariok, who he summons in this elaborate ritual. And one interesting touch I liked Moorcock did with Ariok is that when Elric first meets Ariok, he appears to him as a fly, almost like a reference to Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies. And so then Ariok likes to usually take the form of like a golden youth, and so there's a very strong element of like a Faustian pact, with Dr. Faustus and the Christopher Marlowe play. So again, this idea of this alchemist who hungers for infinite knowledge and power. That is what Elric is. He well, obviously he wants the power to proclaim Cimmeral, but then ends up using it to just go off, adventuring around the world essentially.
And it destroys him in the end.
Yeah,
it's the same. Which is really, I mean, that is also, I mean, that's the reality of power in so many ways. It again reminds me of the Prince in that, or if you look at any of them who got ultimate power, like Constantine, he ended up killing his mother and killing, just like you end up in these awful power situations and completely selling your soul and everything's destroyed. And it's like they are offered the bargain and they're shown what the inevitable end will be. And yet they're forced to plow ahead. It makes for a good story. It's kind of the ultimate story. If you examine the nature of power and like human relations and politics and, at the upper echelons when you truly are wielding power and stuff. So it's great metaphor in that sense to have the sword, like to have it all condensed into a sword representing the power that that you must wield and takes you over.
Another aspect as well I've just thought of is that with Elric, obviously I mentioned he starts out as an emperor, he's a monarch. Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that while he's the monarch, he's relatively not very influential or powerful, considering that, Melna Benet is now just this island. But when he's obviously becomes a mercenary and he's off, adventuring, he actually shapes the world and the fate of it more in that role than he did as an emperor, which again is another interesting inversion of, I guess, traditional history, isn't it? Normally it's the kings or the great men who shape history and not like an individual warrior.
Yeah, and he's a king without or an emperor without an empire. Not even Melna Benet itself remains. After all the havoc that's wrought when he comes back trying to rescue Cimmeral and what is it, Imrir, if I'm remembering right. Goes down in flames. It must be understood that he's born just before or just during the beginning of World War II. And so he would have lived through, the idea of the British Empire, and it was successful and triumphant, at least superficially after World War II. And then, the shit starts to go south and there's the Suez Crisis. And then, by the time you get to the 60s, it's different possessions abroad are being carved off of it. And so there's something of that. There's something of that to the Elric story as well, I would think.
No, certainly. I being a Brit, this comparison to the declining British Empire is very cognizant in my mind. And obviously, I mentioned earlier, Semigog, that we talked about the Milner Group on the stream we did on my channel earlier this year, and this idea of the late British imperial elite, and the men in the Bay and elite, they're decadent. All they're interested in is like sex and slaving and whatnot. It's almost like the hedonistic decline of the people from their once great heights.
But also the idea of the power of an aristocrat, because the education that Elric has received, the sorcery he's been taught, the many languages he knows, the spells he can cast, the elementals and gods that he can call upon, his ability to fight, even though he's a weakling, he's still, very well trained with weapons. So there's this idea of the aristocratic elite still having certain sort of formidable skills that it's been trained in, that it has available to it. And so there's that sort of aspect too. And of course you see this idea of Britain decaying, or there's definitely a more explicit take on Britain in the Castle Brass, the Count Brass series, again with Baron Meliados, and I think there's Emperor Hugh, there's the Order of the Mantis, the Order of the Wolf, the Pig, and others, these pallid people who wear the masks of mask helmets of their castes, and their pale white skin underneath, because they feel naked when their masks are removed. There's
So that's
there's a
cool.
lot.
That's very real too. That's very real too. Because in fact, I remember just seeing just recently. I was listening to, who was it? Someone ridiculous, like who was that Canadian guy? That comedian. Oh shit. Oh, what's his name? Gavin McInnes. And he was talking about how when he was famous, he's still kind of famous, but before he was canceled or whatever he is, he knew these celebrity type people and was staying at their house. He stayed over at Jennifer Aniston's house and people like this. And he was describing it in this one of his little talks. And it's just like, even just like they're actors, I know, but they're the modern elite, let's say, and how divorced they are from normal people in reality. He said, you're over at their house. They barely actually leave the grounds of their compound. They have all their servants do it. They got 12 cooks. He was talking about her, if you look at her, even just walking around her house in her bathrobe, he stayed over at their house, and he's there for days on end. And that, even just seeing her casually, it's like seeing someone who's not quite human, like so constantly sort of beautiful. And I think pale was a reference as well, but like, kind of they reach this kind of inhuman status when they get closed off, when they have enough power, and whatever happens to them, they become this other kind of creature. And it's probably, again, it relates to reality, the Elric story in that sense, or any of the Moorcock stories.
Well, yes, you've got an
That's a
ivory
weird digression.
tower with an ivory tower with ivory women in it. Yes, and when their skin is burnished regularly with almond scrubs, and and they started out with good hair to begin with. Yeah, poor Gavin McInnes. I wish that man when he shaved his beard off. Oh my God!
Wait, he do that recently?
Oh no, sometime back. I remember I saw it. This is when I would look at Gavin McInnes. So this was what, 2015, 2016.
Well, I know he is what he is, and he's got terrible views, but he's still funny. I still find him funny now and again. So
he's funny. He has no chin. Just go looking for. Well, anyway, we don't need to talk about that. But it was shocking. I was like, grow that beard back, dude.
But his way of talking, but he had a good example. Oh yeah, and he said this too. This is part of the story. He was saying because he was there for like a week, he became friendly with the staff, the people, the cooks and whatever, and he brought them a present. And in doing so, he kind of broke. This isn't like California or whatever, right? But he broke they were shocked in a board that he brought them a present, and it like wasn't allowed to recognize the lower people. This is like, we're talking about a severe traditional caste system going on within this this celebrity compound, right? And like, it wasn't allowed that they might get a present, and they have their status. And it was just this funny. He was like just amazed, and it is funny. It just shows that that's how all things wind up in the end. And the nature of these traditional power structures that we might find in these pulp stories that we all love, because it lays it all naked and bare, as saying that, say, the Elric story is an allegory of the Dark Age power struggles and the kingdoms and so forth. And it's all the way things, I was going to say the way things should be, but the way things are. You just kind of rename and you hide it away and stuff.
Well, there's certainly, my few interactions with people of who could, who had upon them the whiff of not just being upper middle class. I've just sort of seen, and only occasionally, and not much, the bottom of the actual upper class. We tend to think of the upper classes as the kind of wealthy upper middle class people that we don't see much, but we know they're there. We'll drive through their neighborhoods. That's just an entirely different world. We think of it as the upper class, but the actual upper classes, yes, there's to whatever
much more divorced from humanity, some another level beyond humanity.
They retain some understanding that distance must be put in place between you and the people who serve you, because they can, things will be revealed about what they do in their private time, or gossip will start. I mean, it's not like they can get the kind of house servants with references that one could have gotten in, say, London or Paris in the 18th century. You're not as likely to find someone who's going to work for you, and you're going to have a Mexican gardener, and you want to close your blinds when you're doing blow off of 3 hookers' bellies when he's out there weed whacking.
Right.
But
yes, you don't want that.
So what about these stories? What do we think, Hitman? You were going sort of forward with what the tale was. I mean, where does it go? What do you think is can you sketch the rest of it? What does it portend? What does it indicate?
Well, Elric ends up going on all these different adventures throughout the Young Kingdoms. He picks up many friends and allies, Moonglum. He meets Rakir again later. He has a couple of adventures with the other Eternal Champions, Sailor on the Seas of Fate and the Vanishing Tower, as we've mentioned. And there's a bit of an arc in the second half of the story, the book, so 4 through 6, where he's after this wizard from Pang Tang, whose name I forget, but he eventually defeats him, and then he ends up in the final book, Stormbringer. He ends up fighting the Chaos Army, and at the very end, also something I forgot to mention is another tragic element of Elric is despite all these friends and allies that he does pick up, he always ends up being alone because Stormbringer has the shocking capacity to friendly fire and kill his friends and just take control. So, for example, it happens with Moonglum at the very end. Obviously, you mentioned it happens to Cimmeril. It also happens in Sail on the Seas of Fate. I think the captain of the ship that he's on for this voyage into the jungles gets too close to him, and Stormbringer zaps him as a sacrifice. And so Elric frequently finds that the Stormbringer kills his deepest friends and loved ones, who's always fated to be alone. And as I said, at the very end of Stormbringer, after he's defeated the big bad evil guy, Stormbringer just then kills Moonglum, and then Stormbringer then turns itself and kills Elric, and then Stormbringer turns into a demon and just sods off, and that's how the story ends. So very, very bleak.
Yeah, that that someone's about to get their soul sucked out. The deaths are always horrible because they realize that it's not just dying; it's that they're literally, their soul has been taken into this demonic blade. Someone's about to die whenever in any of the Elric stories, Elric starts to get along with someone who seems pretty cool. You're like, oh yeah, it's just getting set up for him to be killed. Yeah, it's probably, maybe it's the darkest of all of the Moorcock stories. There are some that like the End of Time. You guys probably haven't read these other ones. But there's what's it called? The not Piet. What's it called? Von Beck. What
happens in the End of Time? Is it about the end of the universe there?
It's the Dancers at the End of Time. I mean, I don't remember it. I think I read 3 books of it. Are there more than 3 books? It's these. Basically, there's this place at the end of time where these people can change bodies and be different sexes, and they just endlessly sort of indulge in sort of, how would you call it, a dissipated, attenuated quest for sensation, an attempt to
it sounds like the modern day. No.
Yes, there's quite a bit of that going on. So there's this idea of these parties, these different great persons who are sort of at the court of this end of time, and how they one will be a man.
Oh dear, he appears to have left us.
He knocked himself out, did he?
Apparently
he didn't.
So. Well,
okay. What do you want to do?
Oops. Oh, sorry.
I hit the wrong damn button. I'm such a boomer. Yeah. So you have these figures that are just sort of aimlessly seeking sensation because everything is over and they're all powerful. So in some respect, you could almost imagine that the End of Time series is an attempt to take a different view of these Lords of Chaos, sort of from the inside out rather than seen from the outside in. There's another of his stories that's the Jerry Cornelius Chronicles. And my brother read all of those, and I have a copy of them. I just never read them. where you've got sort of a, I don't know, there's sort of a spy espionage agent, kind of Jerry Cornelius, another sort of Eternal Champion vibe, but again, sort of deeply subversive, or at least countercultural. But yeah, I don't know that you guys haven't read either of those. So I guess we're coming around. I've been just sort of randomly blathering Hitman. I know that I have to thank Hitman for this stream even happening, because I wanted to do it, and he kind of said, well, why not do it? Let's do it. So you clearly have his work much more recently in mind, and I believe you're younger than I am. So I kind of want to ask, what is your take of this author and this character, as someone who encountered it more recently, and as someone who is in our circles, as it were. In the previous stream that Brandon participated in, we were looking at Conan sort of viewed from the right. And since you've been exposed to the writing, you've read it more recently, what's your take? How would you view this author? And how would you view this character? Well, then the Quorum one as well, since we're talking about others, they're all related. What's your take on them? I often wonder, because I'm looking back at it, and I haven't reread it recently.
Well, a bit of an interesting opinion, I guess I would have, because I said I read Elric many years ago because of watching Razor Fist, and I really dug it at the time. And then I kind of put Moorcock down for a while, because I read Elric kind of before 2020. So, because 2020 is the year where I think I had a great, political transformation. I think a lot of people did, where you just became radicalized with what was going on, if you know what I mean. And so my worldview changed quite significantly from those events. And then I kind of, because actually around that time that, our friend AM Semiagog did his series of streams on Tolkien, because I tried to read Lord of the Rings years ago and couldn't get into it. And after AM kind of covered it, I decided to get into Lord of the Rings properly. And when I got into Lord of the Rings, I really thoroughly enjoyed it and was glad I could finally kind of get it, the traditional fantasy. And then I kind of dismissed Elric a little bit as being subversive. I probably went a bit too. I went a bit Evolian, I guess you could say. And then more recently, as good as Tolkien is, a point that was made by my friend AI Shiatori and Nathan Hood on the Stream on AI's channel was this idea: is, do we talk about Tolkien too much? Is he a bit overblown? And I think that is true to some extent, that he's good, but we can't only talk about Tolkien. And and more recently I decided that because I know Semigok, you'd mentioned that you like Elric, I thought it'd be worth revisiting the character. And then from there I then read Quorum, and having read Quorum, I've now actually got more respect for Moorcock, because it's not, Quorum, though it's got some tragedy there, it's not quite as bleak as the Elric stories. And I've walked away with a much higher respect for him as an author. And what I will say about him as a whole is, I think with Moorcock, he's a particular author in a particular time and place. He was very clearly of the post-war counterculture, and though not being a boomer, he's silent generation. I can definitely see some elements of boomer truth in there, though it's obviously not as strong as later authors. And I think we just had to take him at face value for what he is. He's this mid-late 20th century pulp author, and he's writing what he's going to write, and for that time and place, I still think it's quite good. He doesn't pretend that it's high art or high literature. He's just trying to write entertaining stories, more or less, and and on that basis, I think he's done a good job broadly. And despite some of the things I've said about subversion or his political opinions, this isn't a condemnation. It's just an observation. I hope I've tried to be neutral and not come off too critical of him, but I do think he's a good author that's worth reading, certainly more than people like George R.R. Martin or Neil Gaiman.
Fucking Neil Gaiman.
Fucking Gaiman. Oh, good.
Fucking
that guy. You just didn't mention his name.
God, that fucking guy. Brandon, Here's a question for you. You know, as someone who does not want to, push generations forward into the future who are entirely useless, would you, would you, would you buy Michael Moorcock books and give them to your kids to read?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, for sure. I still have some of the old ones. I still have that airship one. What's it called? I forget the name. That's about
Warlord
the
of
only
the Air.
one I have left. I had, but I don't have any of my Elric ones. Although even actually, when I read Elric, I might have borrowed off that guy and just gave them back to him. It might have been his when I read them. So like that's the thing. Like, so for us, like,
Wait, Mr. Magic Balls.
Mr. Magic Balls, yeah, Mr. Sexy Guy with his fucking bizarre. All I remember of that guy is him and his wife taking me to one of these fucking. I don't know what I shouldn't even say because it sounds so seedy and terrible. But like one of these, it was like a ball where everyone dressed in. It was like fucking what's that Kubrick's last movie? Where they're wearing the masks and it's like a sex party. You know?
Oh,
what's
Eyes
that
Wide
called?
Shut.
Yeah, like, it was like that. And there was like a performance where some woman, was like burned with hot wax and all this, and and I was like, okay, I don't want. I witnessed all this. I sat through it. And I was like, okay, right. This is back when I was
typical Michael Moorcock fan.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, but still, in terms of books and music, that guy was solid gold, and that's when I read it. And so I always think of that guy when it comes up, and I just think. Yeah, like you say, boomer truth stuff. Yeah, he's like definitely of that ilk, and anything I would take with a grain of salt. Anything he says about being a feminist or anything else. Ultimately, he wrote stories that have proper archaic value reference, which means they're real in the sense like he's talking about the power struggle and how it works. The battle between what the individual wants and what is arguably the greater good, and the powers of chaos and everything involved. And that's why it works. That's why it's memorable. And he had good original story ideas. I always associate him too with Gene Wolfe. It was around that time I read both those guys. Gene Wolfe was
Gene Wolfe was a very strange one.
Strange, odd ideas.
I've yet to read Gene Wolfe. I've heard his book of the New Sun's good, isn't it?
It's better.
Very
I think.
Strange.
I think it's better than Moorcock. I would rate him higher than Moorcock myself, to be honest. But they're both really good. They're just good in that kind of, it's pulp. Moorcock has his certain weaknesses, but overall very good. You're not going to encounter anything that's going to like intellectually insult you or anything, and you'll come across crazy, strange ideas, and that that was his job, was to come up with these wild ideas, and he was pretty good at it. And it's too bad there's not more of that now. And I've, in terms of his, if you want to rate it politically, like you just can't. You're not going to find anything to. He may have been an anarchist and these other things, but you won't get anything out of his work that feels like propaganda. Let's say. At least I didn't. Maybe you guys know something more.
Yeah, there's more. I mean, you've got Gloriana, which is kind of a alternate universe take on Queen Elizabeth, and basically her biggest problem is that she can't nut. She can't have an orgasm. And you've got
maybe I'm totally wrong in that regard. I didn't read those ones.
City in the Autumn Stars. You've got like this male-female role inversion where the latter von Beck is big into this this woman who's taller than him, and he's this little saber fighter. I mean, there's some,
but those are minor things sort of compared to what you would see. But compared to what you would see now, like those are really kind of minor things. It's not like you probably get more subversive mild propaganda in Martin, let's say, or wouldn't you? Would you not? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I'd sooner read Moorcock than any of the fucking liberal feminist shite you'd get today, or the current excuses for fancy authors to get published.
Yeah.
I'm just so insulated from all of that. Like, I haven't even read. There are probably new Elric stories that I've just never read because I think Dream Thief's Daughter came out, and I think that was probably, or Fortress of the Pearl. One of those was the last one I read because it really became Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry. I lost you for a minute there. Maybe it was just me though. I don't know.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, I haven't read the new so-called science fiction or fantasy. I mean, if Neil Gaiman is an indication of what it is, I wouldn't go near any of it, man. It just
Oh
seems
god.
horrid.
Oh, it's so
So
bad.
it seems,
My wife was into him briefly for a bit there, until she realized he's a hack. But she kind of explained it to me. I was like, oh, that's. And I tried to read one of them, I think, and I just felt the propaganda seeping through it, and just everything about it was shit. Not just propaganda, but just like bad idea, bad everything, nihilism. It was all there. Like, it's just terrible. I fucking really, really don't like that guy.
yeah. I mean, it made me physically sick. I had to put, what was that, American Gods down. That's Gaiman, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway,
That was the
I don't
one.
want to,
That was the one. Yeah, that's the one I tried to read.
I don't want to, just fucking garbage. Okay, so we're agreed that this guy is an interesting writer. I certainly have to say again, my aim here is not to hammer him. I've probably read more words by Moorcock than I have by any other living author, just because I plowed through it and read it over and over again as a kid. So yeah, I'm thankful for his work, and I found it very interesting. I'll probably go back and read some more of it now. My wife is currently reading the Von Beck stuff. She's like, take out your old box of books. I want to read them. And yeah, so Michael Moorcock, there it is. Before we run, I want to thank both of you gentlemen. I want to thank Hitman again for pushing me to make this happen. Brandon, thanks very much for coming in. And before we go, let's start with Hitman and then move to you, Brandon. Tell people where they can find you. I really want to recommend both of them, their YouTube channels and their stuff on X. But yeah, Hitman, go ahead and tell people where they can find you.
Yes, I have a channel on YouTube where I discuss many different topics, but namely one of my area of expertise and focus is the politics and history of the Middle East. As I mentioned earlier, I've got a series with my friend Hunger the Dye Merchant on modern Iran, from the Safavids to the death of Ayatollah Khomeini. So if you find that interesting, please give that a watch. Of course, I've had Semigog on once before to talk about the Milner Group and the British managerial establishment in the early 20th century. And Charlemagne, who's in the chat, I've had him on to talk about the Suez Crisis and American military presence in World War II. So many, many different topics I've covered as well.
And what's the name of your channel on YouTube, and what's the handle for you over on X so people can find you?
Yeah, so it's just Hitman. The specific handle is at Hitman9801. That's for YouTube. My X is at Hitman with capital H 49441.
Nice. Well, thank you, sir. Thanks very much for being here. Brandon?
Oh, I'm Morius Press on the YouTube and the whatever else, X, Telegram, and Tread West Art on Facebook. You can look at my books on Amazon. Again, I publish a series of science fiction anthologies similar to the works that would have published all these things we're talking about to begin with, every single one of them. And, I like to think it's the modern version of such things. Certainly the mainstream versions of the old school ones, heavy metal and analog, etc., are still trying to continue, but they're all tainted with progressivism or some kind of horrific taint. So I would advise you to check out my Aegeon series, where there's many interesting stories in those. And look out for the stuff I'm coming out with, Guts, etc. It's all going to be on Amazon. And yeah.
And what's the handle over on X so people can follow you there?
Oh, what is it? It's actually at Tread West Art. Still, I can't change that without losing my old tweets. But it's the Aureus Press. There's also an Aureus Press website, which I really need to update very badly. And yeah, that's it. I'm around somewhere, lingering like a vulture.
Excellent. Well, I thank you both for joining me. I thank everyone for coming in. It was a bit of a rambling discussion. That's certainly my fault, but hopefully it will be interesting for some of you who will have been interesting for some of you who enjoyed Moorcock growing up as much as I did. I thank you all for being here, ladies and gentlemen. I am Semiagog, and I am out.